Dissertation is on the impact of traversal fidelity on efficacy of immersive virtual learning environments. My advisors were Dr. Lee and Dr. Vinikov, and thank you for my committee members, Dr. Bioka, Dr. Daher, and Dr. Kumbioka. So on the agenda today, I'm just going to do some basic introduction to the point of this thesis. I'm going to go through some foundational related works, some lit review. I'm going to talk about two studies that were actually conducted, both learning about how immersive virtual learning environments are helpful in STEM education, but one dealing with the participants where they're in a non-mobile or non-traversable situation, either sitting or standing but not moving, and the other where the participants are moving throughout the environment. It is a traversable environment. And then the proposed study, wishing to look at the effects of the fidelities of this traversal on the efficacy of immersive virtual learning environments for STEM education. I'm also going to just talk briefly about how this semester was a bit irregular with the COVID-19 disruption and how it kind of reoriented the chronological events for this study, and then I'll wrap up with a conclusion. So what was the point of studying this topic? Well, the American rankings for STEM education globally, we do really well with our young students. So we're in top 13 in elementary school. We do have a drop, a 6% drop in middle school, and then again, 11% in secondary. So our standings are not as strong, and yet STEM education is so vital to our economic situation these days. So some major factors that have been found through previous studies have to deal with multimedia discrepancies between their entertainment and their educational experiences in their life, the students' lives. And that educational technology actually brings benefits to learners, such as visual short-term memory, abstract reasoning, and spatial cognition. So a possible solution to these STEM engagement situations are these emerging technologies of augmented and virtual reality that are highly immersive and highly visual. But there is a lack of research in identifying proper use cases and design frameworks for these technologies. Especially in light of the pandemic that's been going on, everything's been pushed so hard virtually. These web conferencing tools like Zoom and WebEx are like overloaded to capacity. We're really learning and what it means to collaborate, communicate, train, and grow in a virtual environment. This image is from the startup company Spatial. They've actually hit the news very strongly these last few days. They've released their platform for free. It's a virtual environment. They wish to be the AR/VR equivalent of Zoom. So the participants can log into this three-dimensional virtual space and collaborate on a variety of hardware, either VR headsets, AR headsets, or if you see the person in the middle, just a desktop, a laptop with a web camera. So the two people on the right are actually together in this meeting. The two people on the left are joining via either an Oculus, a Vive, or HoloLens, and the person in the middle is desktop, all meeting in a virtual space to work on a STEM project. So the goals of this thesis, I'm examining just one element of a virtual environment, so one HCI factor, and I'm focusing on a traversal fidelity and its impact on immersive virtual learning environments. And on the left, you can see what the first study is looking at, comparing these immersive virtual learning environments against live instruction without the ability to traverse. These participants are situated around a table and they're not moving around the environment. The second study on the right is looking at an immersive virtual learning environment, but the participant is allowed to freely roam around the environment. In this case, they're interacting with all these stations that are placed around them in a circular fashion. And then the proposed final study to isolate the effects of this mobility of traversal throughout the environment. So some foundational frameworks, where do we start with to start to evaluate these concepts? So we're going to look at the educational psychology or the learning science side. Their fundamentals come from Vygotsky and social constructivism, So an individual constructivism would be that the learner is active in their building of their knowledge processes and their thoughts internally, and that the social constructivism point of view is that you cannot isolate the individual. You have to look at their social conditions, their relationships as this knowledge is forming in their head. And that all modern STEM pedagogy and educational technology follow these principles. So you can see the diagram in the middle where the learner will have experiences. They'll seek to observe and to reflect on these experiences. With these reflections, they'll form ideas, abstract concepts in their heads, and then they'll test these ideas in new experiences, causing a loop, a refinement of this knowledge, this learning that's gaining in their psychology. Since we're looking at educational technology, we're going to have to use some type of HCI framework. So I've selected the user system loop framework. It's focused extensively on 3D user interfaces and experiences. So I think it's a strong evaluation tool for AR/VR educational technology. In the center diagram here, again, we see these type of feedback loops where the user is expressing actions through the input devices available to them. That's the interaction fidelity on the right. These devices then conduct transfer functions, give data to the internal simulations in the computer. The data, the models will get updated, refined in the scenario fidelities of this framework. And then the computer will send back out audio or visual information through its display devices to give input sensory information back to the user to close this continuous loop with the display fidelity side. So there has been a lot of work looking at these immersive AR/VR technologies in STEM education. A lot of it findings based on these visual and immersive effects of these technologies, that they're very good for contextualizing abstract information. So concretizing or grounding down abstract terms in relatable, real physical ways. It's very good for introducing people or learners that might traditionally not approach STEM as a learning or a career situation. A lot of these studies have to deal with physical movements, maybe looking at body poses or artistic expressions that have a lot to do with structure that relates well with STEM education. So the first study, looking at a non-traversable immersive educational technology, we're going to be examining learning communities in a STEM undergraduate university, happens to be NJIT. Below, you can see that learning communities are informal social groups that students bond together with, usually friendships, and that they'll do study groups or talk online or on the phone to help them through their classes. It's a great support structure for science and math and for understanding what their career options are outside school. Now, our university has 3/4 of our freshman students go through a learning community version of a freshman year seminar that all freshmen must take. And about 1/4 are not available. They have to take a non-learning community section, and it's mostly due to scheduling conflicts. So this proves that there needs to be an alternative to physically based learning communities. In addition to that, we can help grow and expand these learning structures that are so important for student lives. So the research questions for this study is, how does a non-traversable immersive virtual learning environment impact user performance? Is it as effective as an in-person instruction? And does the virtualization of this learning environment impact user perceptions? So the aim is to see that if we did learning community training, is it the same as in a physical group, or if they were through a virtual situation, in this case, a virtual reality headset, but separated out physically? So we recruited 90 incoming freshmen to the university. We randomized them into 3 exclusive groups. They did not interact with each other. One was the control. They had no collaboration training. Everything else about their university experience was as is. The first treatment group was a physically based collaboration training. And the second group was the training through a virtual reality shared experience. So the implementation for this is we did groups of 4. We broke each treatment group down into groups of 4. And they had 8 weeks of collaboration training for 1 hour a week on their common hours on a Wednesday. On the left, you can see that the VR group was using Facebook Spaces. It's collaboration software, networked multiplayer, can allow up to 4 people in the circular table, if you look at the picture in the middle. And they have access to talking to each other through the microphone, through pens to draw in 3D space, card games, dice games, and interacting with 3D models that are provided to them. So since Facebook Spaces was limited to groups of 4, that's why the physical group on the right was also of groups of 4 to have the same variable. And the curriculum we co-designed with the freshman year seminar director. On the left, you can see our 8 weeks of curriculum and the 2 treatment groups. They were just very light logical puzzles, icebreakers, philosophical questions that are meant to grow conversation skills in the group, but with no direct answer. And if you notice that the virtual treatment group was offset by 1 week with the curriculum because we had to do 1 week of getting acclimated to the equipment, the experience of interacting with each other in virtual reality. So the assessments we did weekly social metrics assessments that were based off social network analysis on the left. That meant that every week they were to report if they interacted with fellow students in their Common Core classes. And in particular, did you give help or did you receive help? And we offered, we examined, placed the definition down that a social interaction is 5 minutes of academic help in an informal setting, like in the cafeteria or at home, but outside the classroom. And on the right, we have our academic metric, which we gathered when there was Common Core exams and during the final exam. So we had 5 data points throughout the semester. And each student had multiple classes. So we also interviewed the 2 treatment groups, the physical and the virtual reality group. We structured them as 1 hour semi-structured interviews. We had 26 come in from the VR group and 19 from the physical for a total of 45 interviews. And our questions were refined down to try to figure out how these treatments impacted the opinions of the participants on collaboration. We did a 3-stage coding process defined by Campbell, looking for an intercoder reliability of a minimum of 87%. We reached 88%. And we identified 52 codes and grouped into 10 themes. And since they were categorical, we placed them in histograms. So some of the results from this study. These were the academic metrics. These are self-reported semester grades on a scale of 1 for F to 5 for A. This is ordinal count data, so not normally distributed in unpaired groups, so we chose Whitley to analyze it. And you could see that the treatments were not statistically relevant. There was no difference between the physical group and the virtuality group in their grades, but we did notice statistical differences from the physical treatment group to the control group, and from the virtual reality group to the control group, meaning both treatments had statistically higher self-reported grades than the control group. We see here the social metric analysis. We looked at the total sums of help, so we added up both directions, giving and receiving help weekly to see if there are any differences. And then we looked at directional sums. We summed up giving help and we summed up receiving help. and we compared the groups. Since this was discrete data, not normally distributed, and they were unmatched groups, we chose chi-squared. We did, in this graph here on the right, we did notice a statistical difference from the VR group to the control group for giving help out. So they offered more help than the control. And here's one or two themes from our interview data. So after totaling up the frequencies and ordering the codes into themes, we did find some interesting opinion differing that virtual collaboration may impact perceptions of leadership roles on the left and group functions on the right. We see that the physical group in orange on the left, their perceptions of roles, they talk more about being a follower, while the VR group in the blue talks more about being that their roles were more natural and more about their abilities. Hence, the VR group seemed to take a more active role in the group. They thought more of themselves as leaders through this training, where the physical group thought of themselves more as followers. And on the right-hand side, we see the motivations behind this collaboration. So the physical group in orange is talking more about that. Well, the point of all of this is that we like to share ideas. In a group together, the motivation was for us to share our ideas. The VR group in the blue are talking more about a shared workload and helping. They're talking about as a team that comes together, we share our workload together, we'll get more done. So this is their discrepancy, their differences in their group function opinions. So in conclusion, we saw that STEM undergraduate students, they do improve their academic performance regardless of the treatment. It's just learning community training is very good when they first enter college. Physical and VR or any type of virtualization, I guess, would be appropriate. So we see that in the virtual learning environment, participants, they gave more academic help to their peers in social settings compared to the control. And we saw that virtualization of the training may impact perceptions of the participants based on leadership roles and group functions. So this suggests that a non-traversable immersive learning environment may be a good alternative tool to physical in-person collaboration training. And this will lead us into our second study, which, if we're thinking about alternative tools, some other useful use cases for them is, well, a lot of these classes, these instructors will vary. They'll come in with different levels of experience, different levels of, or different styles of delivery, their methods, and their domain knowledge. So educational technology may give students a more consistent learning experience just because they have more options to focus on the material. They have more options to have that learning material expressed to them, regardless of all of these variations in the instructors that they attend to. So instructors are also important because they're the gatekeepers of these mediums, of what's used in the classroom. In this case, the educational technology that may be used in the classroom. So as designers of these technologies, participatory design might be helpful because you're engaging these instructors, you're helping, getting their feedback, and you're making sure that your software works as best as it can to help them in their classroom, increasing the chances that they'll use it. And this will lead us to our research questions for a traversable immersive educational tech environment. And so we're looking at how does a traversable environment impact user performance? Is it as effective as in-person instruction? And is the learning in a traversable environment, how does it impact the user emotions and the usability considerations? So on the left, you could see a physical activity that we're replicating in virtuality on the right. In this case, it's going to be binary counting for computer science middle school students. So we wish to see if a traversable environment can be as strong, give as many benefits as live lecture for teaching binary counting. We went to a summer school computer science camp, We had 34 students, middle school range, 5th to 8th grade, 19 girls and 15 boys. We randomly assigned them into a control with live instruction and treatment for virtual reality. And here on the left, you could see the VR participants are being fitted with the equipment, and they have a nice wide open space in the gym to conduct the session. And on the right is a little splash screen of where we refine the experience to eventually. So this is a view in the headset of the learning task that the VR participants were treated with. This is the number station. Here you can pull levers back and forth to flip bits on and off. In this case, we have a series of 3 bits, and for powers of 2, the first bit can be a 0 or 1, the second 0 or 2, and the third 0 or 4. We have a legend on the right showing the different states of the levers and a total number at the top. And here is a top-down view of this circular layout of the stations that the user in virtual reality will experience. So the user starts in the middle. We'll move toward the task station, be given a task, and we'll move around the number, color, and shape station to set different options with the levers to finally get an output that is hopefully correct based on what the task is that they're given. If it's incorrect, they'll be told so, and they must circle through the stations again. Here we're looking at a space of about 20 by 20 feet, so the diameter of the circle is about 20 feet. So you can see they get some very nice room to traverse through this learning environment. The implementation, we had a series of pre-assessments, training for the VR students to be comfortable in the equipment. Each group had 20-minute learning activity and a post-assessment, and we interviewed the VR students for usability issues. The activity was developed from CS Unplugged, a very popular teaching method that teaches computational thinking without the use of a computer. So on the left-hand side, you can see a teacher putting these cards up on a whiteboard. There's be some magnetic cards that you can flip back and forth. Right above there is kind of a diagram showing the counting that he would be doing. So each card represents a different bit. Powers of 2, and if they're flipped down, they're off, and they're flipped up, they're on, and then you have to understand how to add them together into a decimal format. And on the right-hand side, you can see the number station again, and it's the very reasonable facsimile of the physical experience that was giving it for live lecture. So here's our learning assessment. At the top, you can see that we have these cards flipped on and off, very similar to what they were taught directly, and quizzing them if they can understand what these counting numbers would be. And at the bottom, we have symbols that are different than what they were previously taught on, but a little legend that tells them what these symbols would relate to in the binary world. We see if there's a transfer of knowledge here as we're testing. So for interviewing the virtual reality participants, we did focus groups of 5. It's preferred to do small focus groups with smaller children. Also, we had groups of 5 come in to go through a virtual reality session, and so it's very easy with the process. We focused on usability questions of the experience, such as, did you enjoy moving around? Did you like learning while you were walking? Did you need to stop early? Again, we used a 3-stage coding process by Campbell, looking at intercoder reliability. We had the lead researcher read the open-ended responses from the participants and generate a list of codes. And a second researcher reviewed 10% of the responses until we reached a minimum of 87%. And here it was 91%. Once that was achieved, we coded the remaining responses, counted up the frequencies, and built our histograms. So this is an interesting data set that we're going to look at for a moment. This was, we actually captured the position and rotation of the head and hand hardware as the VR participants were in their treatment. And so this is a kind of a spatial mapping of their behavior, their movement during the time they spent in VR. On the left is the first task. It's like the tutorial task. And we can see the plotting is how much did they move to the left and right on the X and forward, backward on the Y. So if you remember the system diagram, the top down, they start in the middle, they move to the top, and then they move in a clockwise orientation for 7 tasks. You can see that they do get clustered with the red points at the different stations. In that task 1, you could see that it's erratic. There's a lack of focus. They're still kind of exploring the environment mode and understanding what they should be doing there. On the right-hand side, we're 3 tasks out of 7. And you can see that the third task shows a focused movement. It's a very refined plotting between the stations. So here we are looking at the learning assessments that were given to both conditions. On the left-hand side, we're comparing the pre-assessments, the pre-knowledge of the control live instructor and VR virtual treatment. On the right-hand side is post. So where was their knowledge at after what they went through the treatments for control and VR? This was discrete data, not normally distributed, unpaired, using Wilcoxian rank. On the left, you can see that majority of the participants knew nothing. We did have an outlier in the control group that got 1 question answered, but there's no statistical difference between the two. Both groups coming in knew no binary counting. On the right-hand side, you could see that something happened. They did get a lot more answers correctly. So both groups did learn something about binary counting in their treatments. And when we compare the 2 groups, their post-assessments, we see that there's no significant difference, implying that the virtual treatment is just as effective as the live instructor treatment. Here we have our interview data from our focus groups. I'm choosing this theme of user emotions to focus on. Here we have 5 codes, 36 total, and we have a histogram of the frequencies. On the left-hand side, in the blue, we have positive emotions, such as enjoying immersion, enjoying physical activity and learning. And on the right-hand side, we have the negative emotions of feeling bored and distracted. What's interesting to note is that all 3 of the positive emotions were reported at a much higher frequency than the negative emotions, indicating that this was an engaging experience. So in conclusion, we presented binary counting in a gamified, engaging, yet a private manner to the students. These students were observed talking through the steps of the task that they must do to themselves, getting stuck, being frustrated when they get stuck, and yet have jumping into victory dances when they did eventually solve the task. We see that the VR treatment was just as effective at teaching binary counting as live instruction. And so this suggested a traversable AR/VR learning environment is just as effective as a traditional teaching in that it's a useful alternative tool. So this will lead us to the proposed study. So can we look at different fidelity levels of traversal and see how it's impacting the learning of the user? So we're going to examine how this traversal fidelity affects learning, performance, and usability metrics. And we're going to use the user system loop framework from the HCI. And in particular, we're going to look at the right-hand side. We're going to look at the interaction fidelities revolving the user giving input back to the computer. Within the interaction fidelities of the subdomains, the subtopics, we're going to focus on biomechanical symmetry. This is how much does a body part get recreated from a real-world task when they're conducting that interaction technique in the virtual environment. Within biomechanical symmetry, we're going to be analyzing some subtopics, and the two ones that are particular of note for this study is anthropometric symmetry, which is how much do the body parts get recreated from a real-world task, and how much are they required by the interaction technique. And then kinematic symmetry is how much does the actual body motion of a real-world task get recreated by that interaction technique. So we're looking at the body parts and how they're moving and how that's being recreated in the virtual environment. So the research questions are: how does the traversal fidelity of an immersive virtual learning environment impact user performance? And in particular, how does it impact learning, retention, and task completion time? On the left, you can see a participant in virtual reality, and at the bottom, here's the actual bubble sort algorithm that they're moving through the list with. So the related works. So there were research looking at how traversal may impact learning in virtual environments, but this research revolves heavily around industrial, military, and navigation and naval situations. So we saw that can we use virtual reality to help workers in complex industrial facilities traverse around the environment better, understand their environment, their situational awareness. They found that using virtual environments increases the amount of situations that they can present to the learner and increases their ability to move about the environment. Same was done in a vehicular situation. So in this case on ships, so how to traverse or navigate on a ship, and it helped improve naval officer focus. But there is a gap in how do these traversal tasks impact a general learning situation, or in this case, a STEM learning situation. Previous research has also looked at what are these traversal techniques about. So one pair of researchers looked at some basics of traversal in a virtual environment. They explored what are the psychological factors for the user, including exploration and travel inquiry. And from their studies, they built some practical frameworks on how to just present these ideas of a natural walking for traversal and a hand controller-based walking style for traversal. Another study looked at how presence in virtual environments can be impacted by the style of traversal. And they actually found that giving the users a more natural walking style improves their sense of presence in the virtual environment. And I'm interested to wondering if that actually can be applied over into a virtual environment as well, or a learning virtual environment as well. So the aim of this study is how does traversal fidelity of these learning environments impact learning? In this case, we're looking at a CS sorting algorithm called bubble sort. So fundamental, some of the first sorting algorithms that an undergraduate CS student or even a secondary student would learn. So since this is an abstract concept of moving through a list, there's this idea of motion attributed to it. This might be aided really well with constructivist learning principles in an exploratory virtual environment. And then we want to take a controlled situation of varying that traversal and see how it impacts learning, retention, engagement, and usability factors. So for this experiment, the null hypothesis being that varying kinematic symmetry, the body movements of a traversal fidelity in a virtual learning environment, will impact the learning of the user. And the alternative hypothesis is that varying these same fidelities will not impact learning. But evidence for either will be interesting information for the HCI and the educational technology communities. So for the participants, a recruit from the IT 201 classes for extra credit for the students and randomly assign them to these two treatment groups. They'll be exclusive. There'll be 25 participants in each for 50 participants. So based on power analysis from statistics using the defaults of 5% significance, 80% effect size, this tells us that we should aim for 25 participants. At the bottom, the table, the interesting note is just that I'm calling the most natural walking situation, the most natural traverse situation, full traversal, and I'll be calling the hand controller pad based walking situation a partial traversal situation. So if you look on the right, on interaction fidelity, we'll be focusing on biomechanical fidelity, our symmetry, and within there, we're going to be holding anthropometric symmetry stable the same. They're both going to be standing. They're both using the same body parts. We're just going to be varying the kinematic symmetry. One group will actually physically walk through this 3D representation list. The other group will stand still and use their controller pad to move. So to show this, we're going to show the full traversal group actually has the ability to walk up and down this list, which is waist high, it's like a table, to sort the elements, to learn bubble sort. The second group, having the partial traversal treatment, will use the hand controller to move the table or the list back and forth for them to interact with the individual elements. Here you see a little sample video of what the treatment looked like as a stimulus to the participant. So they have this kind of sliding tray, I'm going to call it the interactive console, that moves along this table that's waist high, the brown object, and that there's elements in a sequential order representing the list. In the back part of the console, they have this directions telling them what to do and guiding them. And toward the bottom, they have the interactive part where they have a swap button and a next button. Notice as they get to the end of the list, when they hit next, the tray, the console moves all the way to the beginning. And then they have some additional information like a 2D representation of the list that helps them understand the relative differences between the size of the elements in the list in their current process through sorting the list. Here I'm just showing that in the first task, we have the most basic list, this list of 3. And as the tasks increase, we have up to 7 tasks. The later tasks get more difficult. The list is longer. It takes more steps to swap them. So the list grows to up to 8 elements, giving the user about 10 feet to the left and right to actually move and walk because they have to be within arm's reach of this console, which moves between 2 elements in the list at a time. 2 elements because you have to choose to swap or not. So there are visual and interactive elements in this scenario. There's no audio stimuli. We have a tutorial and 7 tasks. It takes 15 to 30 minutes to complete. At the beginning of each task, this station, the brown waist-high table, grows to accommodate the larger list, and the console gives directions to the user on how to complete this task. During the task, the user is allowed to move sequentially left to right through the list. With the next button, they're allowed to swap the currently selected 2 objects or not. And when they're at the end of the list, the next button will return to the beginning of the list. The setup where the experiment will occur, the participant will be given 20 feet to the left and right total, 6 feet forward, backward of empty room. No physical obstacles for them to trip on. They'll be trained and fitted with the VR equipment, and they'll be instructed whether they can walk naturally, part of the full traversal group, or if they must stand still and use the thumb controller on the hand pad to move the environment around them. They'll also be instructed that they'll have virtual hands, that they can push through these big virtual buttons as the only interaction they have available to them. And just a quick disclaimer, I'll cover this more in depth later. I did collect data for this study before the campus closed in mid-March. The procedure that I went through, I gathered pre-assessments, which involved a consent form, demographic, and a knowledge assessment. I did train the participants on the equipment and the procedure. They went through 15 to 30 minutes in the virtual learning environment with tutorial and 7 tasks. The headsets will record the position of in rotation of the head and the hands, as well as recording the task time, the video and audio for analysis. In the post, they'll gather on the knowledge assessment, motion sickness assessment, and usability questions. The retention will be the knowledge assessment given remotely through Google Forms in 1 day, 1 week, and 1 month from the treatment. So here we have the demographic survey. So it determines if there's statistically relevant information in the population to report. This was used in a lot of our previous Mixer Lab research projects, so it's been standardized a lot over the studies. We're looking at gender, age, ethnicity, language, how much technology use for video games, AR, and VR that these participants are coming into the study with. And this is the learning assessment. So it's 4 multiple choice questions dealing with the intermediate steps of sorting a list for bubble sort, starting from a small list of 3 elements, which is the first task, moving up to 4, 5, and 6 elements. And you can see that the number of intermediate steps grows as the size of the list. The participants were given paper and pencil to work out the steps needed to select the correct answer. These questions were taken from popular computer science training websites and were pilot tested on 5 of our undergraduate students. The simulator sickness questionnaire is 15 liquor type questions developed in 1993 and used extensively in aviation and other virtual environment simulation studies. The usability assessment is the lengthiest assessment of them all. It totals 16 liquor type questions and 10 open-ended questions. I chose to focus on open-ended questions instead of interview data because I could still get a lot of enriching information, qualitative data, without having to spend the time interviewing the 50 subjects. So a lot of these usability questions were refined from the Mixer Lab's previous studies, and they were pilot tested on that same group of undergraduate students. Here's the beginning of the questions. To start off with, we had 8 usability questions, and each of them had an open-ended follow-up question. Please explain your answer in your own thoughts. So for example, here's the first 3 of 8, and each of these 3 had an open-ended question following up. So now I can gather quantitative data with the liquor type questions and dig deeper in with the qualitative open-ended questions for each. Here's the remaining 8 questions dealing with general usability and engagement inquiries. The next section of the usability assessment dealt with presence. So these are 4 questions dealing with user presence on a Likert type scale. And for this section, there was 1 open-ended question at the end. These questions were taken from Immersive Media, a book by Dr. Bioka. And it's a smaller section focusing on presence. A similar sized section on spatial awareness, also taken from Immersive Media. And there's Likert type questions, and at the end, just 1 open-ended response question dealing with spatial awareness. So I would analyze these open-ended qualitative questions in the same manner that I approached the interview data. I would use a 3-stage coding process by Campbell for intercoder reliability. Take the lead researcher would read through the open-ended responses, generate a list of codes. A second researcher will review 10% of the responses and aim to reach at least an 87% reliability metric. Then the codes from the responses would be counted up, organized into themes, and displayed as histograms. So what are some potential outcomes from this study? So here we have the learning assessments. This table plots or shows on the left what we would compare to on the right and what possible statistical differences may occur, and then what would be the interpretations on the right-hand side. So for example, the top row, where I would be interested in seeing if the pre-learning assessment of the full traversal group has any statistical differences to the post-assessment of the same full traversal group. If the post-learning assessment is statistically larger, has a statistical difference, and it's increased than the pre, well, I would be happy. That's what I would expect to happen. So the green is most likely, and the emoticons show me what I would feel about it. So I would be definitely happy because I would show that there was learning happened in the full traversal group, and that's what I expect to happen. These students will come in with minimal knowledge of bubble sort, and they will have learned something. Now, the same with the second group, so the partial traversal on the second row there. I would compare the pre-knowledge assessment to the post, and I would anticipate that the post would have a statistical difference to the pre. It would have a stronger knowledge in the participants. I'd be shocked if no learning occurred, and if a reduction of learning happened statistically, it's not even possible in the assessment, so I'd be horrified. So the bottom one is actually what I'm most interested in. I want to compare the post knowledge of the partial traversal to the post knowledge of the full traversal. I would expect most likely that there won't be a difference, but I would be very happy, and I think there is definitely a likely chance that the full traversal group will have learned statistically more than the partial group, just due to having a more natural movement through these 3D representations of the lists, aiding in their knowledge growth through a constructive manner, that they're not inhibited by having a partial traversal mode. This slide is looking at the retention assessments. So the top one, I would compare within the full traversal group what their post knowledge was compared to their retentions, which were 1 day, 1 week, and 1 month after the post. More than likely, there won't be any differences in the short term, like 1 day. There might be a difference in the medium term of a week, and I would definitely think that there'll be a statistical difference from their post to 1 month later. It's just they haven't reviewed the material. It's been a month. They're just going to remember less. But I would be very happy if knowledge retention showed no statistical difference in the long term for the comparing post to the month. The same applies for partial. I expect there to be a degrade of knowledge over time. I expect there to be not a significant difference 1 day, maybe even 1 week later, but a month later that they'll see a similar drop in knowledge compared to the full traversal. When comparing the two, the day, the week, the month, for full traversal against the same time frame in partial, I would expect to see no difference, but it would be very happy if I saw that retention was statistically different in favor of full traversal. And then the usability assessments. So here we have the 8 questions for usability, the 4 questions for presence, the 4 questions for spatial awareness. So if I'm comparing the partial traversal usability section against the full traversal usability section, I would expect to see a statistical difference in that the participants were happier, would prefer a full traversal situation. It's a more usable experience for them compared to partial, just based on previous research. For presence is a similar situation, since the previous research showed that there is a connection between a more natural traversal style and the presence of the user. I would expect to see a statistical difference between partial traversal and full traversal in regards to the presence questions. And I think there's not going to be much difference between spatial awareness between partial traversal and full traversal. I thought it was interesting to include if a more natural traversal actually impacts their awareness around them, particularly since part of the space deals with this 3D representation of the list. So if I see a difference in learning, I would like to see if spatial awareness had a difference as well, implying that maybe the more natural walk style gave them a more awareness of their surroundings, and in which case, since the list is splayed out spatially, that aided their learning as well. So since we are doing this presentation virtually and we know that the campus is closed down, I was getting warnings that this might happen in January, that the campus might shut down. I did work very closely with my co-advisors to design this study as strongly as we could for the dissertation committee, and we did go through an IRB proposal in February, and it was approved. In March, mid-March, I did recruit and collect data the week before that campus closed, that week before spring break. And during the end of March and beginning of April, I did gather the remote retention assessments. So the data collection, due to this extraneous circumstances, was executed, but I have yet to analyze the data and write the final report on the findings. And so I am seeking approval to accept this as the proposed study, since studies will not be run possibly till past spring 2021, in which case the thesis may be out of date. So in conclusion, we examined 3 studies. We found that one study in a non-traversal virtual learning environment compared to live instruction, we saw it was just as strong, that academic performance was improved regardless of treatment, physical and virtual, and that the virtual group did give out more help. So virtual training for collaboration is as effective as live instruction without traversal of the environment. In the second study, we looked at an immersive virtual learning environment against instruction, in this case, with the ability to traverse it through the virtual environment. We saw that both treatments were effective in teaching binary counting to middle school computer science students, and that the virtual environment was engaging. It did give positive emotions to the users. So both these studies suggest that an immersive virtual learning environment is an effective alternative teaching tool. And this leads us to this last series of questions in this proposed study, where can we isolate the effects of different fidelity levels of traversing through the environment for this virtual learning environment. And so back to the beginning, to pull this back, we have identified that there's a lack of research identifying augmented and virtual reality educational technology use cases and design frameworks. We can see in the current light of the global situation how understanding how best to use these virtual technologies can only help us in many ways. In that, especially in education and collaboration situations, it's very important to understand these, to create these proper virtual software environments as alternatives. So I want to thank my advisors, Michael and Rita. Now we'll enter the question phase, and ask Michael if he can stop recording at this point.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric, for your presentation. I think Frank suggested that we keep the recording on for the question, just so that you have a record of it. Um,
Sure.
so everyone's okay with that. You are going to be recorded. So we're going to move into the question phase, as this slide says. So first, we're going to have public questions, and then we're going to move into private questions. So I want to thank everyone for attending Eric's presentation. So first, we'll go into public questions, and I think first we can maybe ask the audience for questions, and then we'll go into the committee members for more specific questions, since they saw the presentation and also read the dissertation. So does anyone in the audience have general questions for Eric? Feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions. I think it's a small enough group that we won't really be talking over each other. All right, I'll wait a few more seconds. Okay, no questions from the audience members yet. So why don't we move on to the committee with the public questions? So Frank, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Eric, for see that the document that you and stuff.
Sorry to interrupt. I can't hear you very well. Can everyone else? Eric? Can you hear Frank?
Unfortunately, it seemed like he was cutting out. I couldn't hear him.
Yeah, sorry, Frank. It seems we can't hear you clearly.
I'm going to change audio device.
Okay, great.
Let's go to this guy. Can you hear me a little better now?
I can hear you much better. Eric?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So okay, that remote device allows you to move, but this one has a better component. So yeah, so thank you. I could see that this presentation has some material that I didn't see in the dissertation, made some things a little clearer. And then it's in this more general discussion rather than digging down into the material. I'd like to ask some general questions. One, you are moving into this area in your study about, and these were the theories to why you expect an effect, about embodied cognition. So the very idea that there is some relationship between physical motion and the retention of information, and potentially the gaining of some relationship between body motion and some set of pieces of information. And there's some support for that in the case of embodied learning. One of the questions I had and concern I had was that you're taking abstract information, in this case, bubble sorting, and it's a series of lists and a series of motion. Usually in this domain, the information has some spatial component, but in this case, the bubble sort is not inherently spatial. It's not like map navigation or spatial navigation or understanding a space or a procedure that's physical, like assembling a gun or something of that kind that has spatial components to that.
Sure.
And so, what's the basis by which you feel, I can propose one, but I'll give you the question, that why you feel that the mapping of spatial navigation will help with the retention of this abstract information?
Sure. Yes. So this is a computer science sorting algorithm. It's abstract by nature. It's just dealing with numbers. In reality, it actually has no physical component to it. But I would argue that as we learn these scientific and math principles, we look to our physical reality to relate to it and to remember it. So when we learn counting to begin with, our math will look to our fingers to remember which number we're on, or we'll learn how to count on objects, so 3 apples and 4 oranges. And we'll start learning math operators on a similar way. If I give you 3 apples and I take 2 away, how many do you have left? I think it's been well documented in math, in STEM education, that the proper way to teach this is in a constructivist manner. where learning, you cannot remove the learner from their environment. You cannot remove them from the body. These are, as you say, the embodied learning situations. You cannot kind of separate the mind from the body's input, the sensory information. And that only over continually learning these principles with a physical component to it, whatever the component needs that the learner needs, that only will that concept become into an abstract nature where they can remember it, use it, communicate it with others, connect it with other knowledge that's also abstract. So since we're dealing with younger learners, middle school and high school, and they're still in a very hyperactive learning situation, I would argue that giving a physical nature and something that they're very used to. So if they're used to sorting objects in their environment, cleaning their room, placing stuff around them to remember when they're using some articles that are needed for a task, it'd be much easier for them to remember this information. And later on, as they repeat learning it, it will become more similar to its abstract nature, which the teacher wants to get the learner towards. So I feel these are very useful alternative teaching tools when they integrate physicality or embodied learning with this abstract concept.
Yeah, so I think so. The argument is that fundamentally the motion allows some sort of additional retention so that you've got some physical motion associated with the task, and somehow that cements the knowledge a little bit better. There is, for example, in the abstract area, going back to Galton, almost 100 years ago, people visualize the number line as a line in space and think about numbers as a sequence in space and use that as a way to conceptualize a very abstract thing like a number series. So it might apply here. You may have a series of steps that might be somehow embodied and visualized. So that's that manipulate. And you just as also too, just to be aware that in a literature called state-dependent learning, it's possible that in your case, that people sometimes when they engage in a body motion are much easier to retrieve the information that they recorded that involved body motion. Right. So actually, the actual physical motion might allow them to retrieve information because it's mapped to the body. So the motion of the body might actually help them remember the series. It would be good if you could activate that at the measurement stage, but that's so the manipulation might activate that. And here we can drill down into more areas, but I want to give some chance to some of my colleagues to ask a general question. But I did see this in the proposal that I saw, but I saw that you had a this is a motion task, and you had a behavioral measure. And in this study, there's no report of a behavioral measure, but there's evidence in study two that you were able to collect and have collected behavioral data. Will you be collecting behavioral data here and reporting?
With behavioral data from study two, you're referring to the user emotions, the positive and negative emotions?
That's right. So all of these are now self-report measures, multiple choice, people's belief and things of that kind. But people are doing things. It takes a certain amount of time to do it. They're physically moving in space. So there are measures like time. There are measures like motion. There's measures of, and so there's physical activity. Now, in your case, you have people are stationary, but there are potential time measures and other physical motion measures that are potentially valuable data and might predict their memory. Right.
So the behavioral component, when I've used these 8 usability assessment questions, I kind of range in how much the question phrases emotions within the sentence or not. So did you need help with using this interface with the learning task, or did you enjoy this moving your body? So some questions have removed the emotional component and some have intentionally added it. So as far as the behavioral component, I would use the questions that have emotional wording and look at their qualitative data to build codes and themes, much like I did in study 2, where I was able to find some reporting on user emotions, their engagement situation with the treatment.
Well, let me just give you an example. This would be a classic one, a very normal one in usability. When people are doing this sorting task, they're going to do it correctly or they're going to make an error. And so it could be, they reverse the error. So there's an error component. They make X number of errors. You might predict that in your spatial group, they may make less errors or they may end up making more errors. Error, which is a behavior, is a potential measure. It's right there inside your data that might tell you a little bit about what's going on during the learning.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did collect position and rotation, how much time they're spending on each task. So I'm recording which tasks they're in, if they're successful or failed, and then I actually broken it down into sub parts of the task, which station, which lever are they actually interacting with at that time. So yes, you're correct. I could actually use task and subtask time to completion and error rates between the groups and look at their differences in these usability assessments to garner some of this behavioral information.
Yeah, so well, I'll just stop there. Just turn it over to my colleagues here, and then we'll return to discussion maybe.
Great. Thank you, Frank. Salam, do you have any questions for Eric?
Yes. Well, first of all, good job for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I have a question for you. Do you think the choice of the task can affect your results? So, for example, the task that you chose is an abstract one, whether for the binary counting or for the bubble sort. Do you think if your task like really needed the traversal, the walking in the space as an integral part of that task, your results would be stronger or maybe less strong? I mean, so do you think that could affect your results on one side? And I'm going to continue the question. It's a kind of like double part. And another part is like considering the control for that task. So for example, right now, for the bubble sort, the control, I'm assuming people are just sitting where they are in the class. They're not moving around. So maybe if they're learning that as a control, as like the people just changing seats, changing locations, would that change the nature of your control? That's something that's interesting. I don't know the answer for it, but it's something that comes to my mind when you were saying that. I know that, for example, with, let's say dance class, and like you learn the material standing on the right or standing on the left. Sometimes you remember it more when you change position. That's something that spatial information is interesting in it. Whereas like for something that's abstract, maybe the changing location is not an important part of that. I can also think of another example. For example, in healthcare simulation, there is something to be said about the physicality in there. So for example, if you have a patient and the nurse or the doctor walks around the patient, or like flip the patient to see their back, or look from different perspectives, there's also part of physicality in there, which is adding more complexity. So all of these, do you think some of those could affect the results of what you're exploring?
Oh, absolutely. That's the point of this exploration. Is there's you could even say there may be near infinite fidelities of traversal, but at certain levels you're going to see those defined changes. In this case, learning for the performance and their usability preference. Yes, I could have made more treatments. I could have changed the control. I could have had the control sit or stand. I could have had a 2D representation of a list. But since study 2, and that begs the question for future research. We can see where this study goes. If there was a difference, well, that says, traversal fidelities do impact the learning situation of this abstract material. Let's look at further refinements of these fidelities or different types of traversal methods to continue finding where the important differences lie for this design framework. But I'll call back to study 2, where binary counting, a similar abstract topic in math or computer science, that it's useful to look at in a spatial way, although it is abstract. We looked at comparing the students were seated for the live lecture, and they were just watching the instructor on the board perform these calculations or teach them this math, compared to the virtual group that actually did move through an environment that was teaching them that. So I would argue that that study showed that allowing somebody into a spatial environment for an abstract topic, allowing them to move through an abstract or a spatial environment to learn this abstract topic, compared to those who just sat there and listened in a passive way, there was something to it. The usability, the behavioral did change. So I would say that I kind of showed that is possible, and it is, this moving through this environment does impact learning of this abstract topic. So let's look at just that idea of moving through that environment. And since there's only so many variables I can analyze for one study, I chose to keep the control and the experiment in the bubble sort. I chose to keep them the same situation with the standing. Keep them standing, just let one of them walk and let one use the control. But yes, we can absolutely, this just means that there's more studies that can be done with this idea of traversing or moving through a spatial situation to learn an abstract topic in STEM education.
Okay, I mean, yeah, there's always infinite amount of variables that you could change. I know, and I like picking which ones is always a tough call. One thing I was just thinking about, like, could the traversal be independent of the technologies? For example, you could have your classroom be as it is right now. You sit and you watch a lecture, or it could be the same activity that you did, which has like a similar, like a jackpot type of thing. And what do you call it? Like the lever thing, where like if they actually had that classroom had those stations as a physical thing, would that have a comparable result to the virtual?
Absolutely.
So that's where I was going with that thought. I'm not suggesting that you go and build those, because like that's a whole kind of form there. But like it's just something to interesting to think about.
No, that is interesting. I would have the exact same spatial layout of the list, like a 10-foot long table in physical reality, and emulate the same situation in VR, and have a series of elements on the table that the participant must move through in the physical table and in the virtual table. That'd be very interesting. Yes.
Anyway, that's all my questions.
Okay, thank you, Salam. Hannah, do you have any questions for Eric?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, Eric, thank you very much. This presentation is really great, and I'm really interested about your study as well. So I find a lot of opportunity as well. So actually, I have two questions to you, and then one is quite related with the Salam's question. It wasn't my previous. I was thinking that this is my second question, but I want to give you the first one because it is related to the Salam's question.
Okay.
So the way of interaction is a different feedback and a different mental model. So for example, when you're doing the physical control, some of the get the context for the education purpose. There's a mental model is quite different when I see your slide 24, especially you showing the physical, the prototype and the virtual prototype. So I think that there are a lot of differences to get the data because the condition is quite different. So the user is the approach each of the different control, and then you just compare the two things. I think it's a little bit there is a lot of limitation to comparing. So I want to know how you can compare two different mental model interaction way for the usability test data.
Yes. So the way the activity was presented to the participants. There is variability there. We did stick to one activity and tried to be as faithful to its representation in virtual reality in this case. But yes, the instructor on the left are using these flat cards that are flipped up and down to represent a bit. And this idea of a bit being able to be turned on and off, and that each bit can represent some other piece of information, is represented differently to the participant in the VR on the right. Although I would argue that the core idea is the same. So the essence of educational technology or any type of other teaching medium, there is going to be that translation difference in presentation. I would argue that the core idea, the schema, so if we look at this as an idea that a learner must absorb, that the essence of it, the schema is the same, it's just the presentation is different. I would say that as the design, that is something that with educational technology, it's to be designed, and there will be this element of bias, or there needs to be some type of design decisions by the creator of the technology. I cannot absolutely recreate reality exactly, nor should I seek to, because I think if we look at these as alternative teaching tools, that these educational technologies are useful in addition to the core instruction, that it's good that there is some variability in the presentation, because every learner just has a unique set of sensory input coming into their mind, a unique set of neural mappings, connections of processing what information is giving to them, and a unique way of giving feedback back to indicate this idea that they've absorbed. So I think as long as the technology implementation of the idea is the same in the core idea. In this case, can we represent the idea of bits being on or off, and that these bits are representing, in this case, powers of 2, that we can say that these are fair comparisons between the control and the treatment.
Okay, so I think we need to talk about that part a little bit more. Is a kind of related with the UI part as well. But you already mentioned that you are more concerned with interoperability. But that's why you need to more concerned about how people's interaction with the visual cue for getting the education purpose. So that's why I'm asking you that question. And then my second question is a sample of data. I think you are collecting a lot of good data, and especially when you choose some of the participants for each of the studies, you need to consider of the participant age and gender, any other condition, because the education, especially education contents and the context, is very important. It depends on the age. So you let me explain during your answer from the Frank's question. You little bit answered that, but I want to know more about what is the impact of your sample of the participant age or participant age group. So what is the difference in your context of the education to when you build up the prototype also? And what is the impact to your data difference between your age of the group?
Sure. We learners of different ages and genders and backgrounds are going to have different experiences with the teaching mediums. The two, I won't talk about study 1 because I didn't build that software. We just developed the activities. But I'll talk about study 2 and 3. Study 2 here, you have the binary counting. This activity was chosen because this is what, when we consulted with the instructors of the computer science camp, this was part of their curriculum. So for this age group, we chose this topic of binary counting. So I think in this situation, we dealt with the age appropriately in the topic selected. And when we designed the experience, yes, everything, first off, age really impacts the height of the user. And so I made sure that I read the height of the headset to make sure all the stations were very easy to access. I didn't want the levers to be really high in the air or like the passive user elements to be unlegible because they're angled up too high or something. So in regards to the height of the user, specifically the age of them, everything is at waist or chest height, so the user interface is very usable for the age consideration. As far as planning out the experience based on the space, the idea of stations we went with because it's a very universal idea, regardless of age. These idea of kiosks that you can go up and interact with them, I think is appropriately dealt with such a young audience. And the idea we went with a very simple interaction, just pulling the lever. So building stuff for virtual reality has been interesting because every age group across the board usually has not experienced the technology that much. So we purposely make everything very simple to understand, very usable. So I think we're addressing the age fact in that regards as well with the design of the experience. The spacing between the stations were taken into consideration for various age groups. We don't want the children with smaller gates, smaller steps to get exhausted between the stations. We want there to be, we don't want to introduce the idea of physical exhaustion to impact the learning experience based on the different ages. So I think we address that situation as well. In this study, there happens to be a strong balance between females and males. I think there were more girls than boys. So I think our results back are now gender inclusive. They've been resulted well. For study 3, I'm just going to move to that. Here we decided to pick an algorithm. So moving on with spatial learning or representative information laid out in a spatial way for an abstract topic seemed to work really well. And so we moved to sorting algorithms in the same STEM topic of computer science. And the idea of lists, although they're abstract, seem to apply well in a physical way. So that's why we selected this topic. And in addition, we were dealing with a different age group. So we're dealing with high schoolers and college students that are undergraduates. And based on standard computer science curriculum, bubble sort is the first sorting algorithm that's taught, and it's a very simple algorithm. So I think age-wise, this was appropriate. We made the experience very simple again, and very, I don't want to say these containers are fun, but I think this actually could work well with a younger age group, although we didn't test on them. So I think this is still age appropriate for the middle school. Computer science education is being introduced at younger and younger ages. So it's so important. And it's been in the high school level for a long time. And I have talked to some middle school teachers that do bring in these basic or fundamental concepts toward the end of middle school. So I think that is age appropriate. And these containers having these little fun geometric shapes that move around, a different way to count the objects in it, I think also acclimates well for a younger age in addition to the high school and undergraduate. Although I would have to run a study on that age group, which I have yet to do.
Sure. So I think you need to more clarify what is the impact of your target of the user for studying. So you need to clarify. I'm not saying that you need to compare the age group, but you need to make sure to clarify why your target is user for the selecting the data is that age group. So because that is very important for creating the interface design and interaction design as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So thank you.